Hi, I'm Steve Gompertz of QRx Partners, and welcome to this week's Quality Heretic. One of my themes, throughout these videos has been kind of the things we miss as manufacturers when we're trying to implement quality and quality systems. That we get the black and white of the standards often, but we sometimes miss the subtleties, and therefore we leave things hanging at the edges or just missing at the edges of our processes. And the one I want to talk about this week is what we would commonly refer to as supplier qualification or supplier management. But I want to talk about the idea of supplier disqualification. This is something I see quite often when I do audits or consulting with my clients. Everybody, because it's in the standards, they apply, right? They've got something around how to manage their suppliers. Hopefully, something that's risk-based, right? That you don't treat every supplier the same way, and they get very focused on the qualification of those suppliers and then the management of those suppliers. And then they usually have, supplier corrective action process, or we commonly refer to as a SCAR process for when things don't go right. But then I often find myself asking, I go, so at what point do you cut them loose? And I usually kind of get that head tilt going, well, we'll just sort of know, right? It's like, okay, right. Nothing in quality systems is supposed to be that ad hoc. It should be built into your process. And I just find that often it's just not there. We're so focused on getting a supplier and showing that we did the right thing. And I understand in a lot of companies, that's because you're doing it after the fact, right? You've already been in business and you've had those suppliers. So you just want to demonstrate or kind of catch up and go, yeah, here's how we built a supplier file and all is good. And yeah, we do incoming inspections and we know when to, ping our supplier for doing the wrong thing, but they're missing that process approach to it, right? And as I always talk about, you have to keep that process approach in mind, which is predicated on the PDCA concept: plan, do, check, and act. So, from a supplier management perspective, let's look at what you're supposed to remember to do there, right? The plan piece, right? P is your selection criteria. And again, hopefully that's something that's risk-based, and typical is, you've got an A, B, C, D, or 1 through 4, or some sort of, right, scaling for your types of suppliers with critical or at the highest level. And there you do on-site audits and you get a certificate from them. And right, they go through more inspection. But that's the plan piece of this. The do is that obviously you continue to you use that selection criteria to select and evaluate and select your suppliers, right, based on that criteria and their ability to meet that. And then the check is now we start getting stuff from them, and we, like I said, we do our inspections, we monitor performance, right? We have hopefully supplier metrics for the ones that require it in our risk-based scale of suppliers. And then the last piece, of course, is ACT. And we know this piece. This piece is always there. There's always some sort of corrective action. Like I said, SCAR is the very common term. A lot of companies, though, just don't treat it any different than any other kappa, which is fine, right? It just happens to be a kappa opened for a supplier as part of the source of the nonconformance. But the piece that's missing in part of ACT is you should have criteria that says, when do we disqualify that supplier? Or maybe when do we put them on probation? Even that's, okay. But we just sort of have this, oh yeah, when they make a mistake, we've got a process for, making them correct it and hopefully put in corrective action so they don't do it again. But at what point do you go, enough trouble with this supplier? We need to move on to somebody else and make sure that it's clear in, if you have an ASL, established approved supplier list, right, that you now have identify them as a supplier not to be used, or maybe not to be used for certain services or types of products. But that piece is often missing in the procedure. So remember, this PDCA process approach, not just for supplier management, but for all of your quality management system processes, but there should always be that element. And you should always be looking, particularly when you're doing your periodic review of your SOPs, is looking at it from the PDCA perspective and go, do we have actually elements in this that show a cycle, a feedback cycle? But for those supplier management procedures, like I said, I'm willing to bet money that yours doesn't have one in terms of disqualification, because see it at least 80% of the time, it's not there. It's how do we get a supplier on board and then we're good. And it's like, but that's not the end of the story, right? It's not a finite process. It is a continual process under PDCA. So that's my short discussion for today. Would love to see this in the comments. Find out how many of you have already built this in, and have you got creative ways of handling that, or maybe somebody would want to share what that criteria looks like. At what point do you go enough, or do you have a probationary period? So again, looking forward to next week's discussion, but also please let's get something going for this week in the comments section.